global politics when it comes to Russia and China. I go, well, tell me the differences. I said, one's a society, the other one is Russia. I said, China's fully built. We may have issues, but it's fully built. Russia is a gas station that needs big difference.
Good afternoon. I want to thank everybody who joins us. The Ukraine Media Center Ukrinform continues its operation. My name is Olga Atamanova. It's been 9 years that the war is going on, and it's day 372 of the full-scale invasion of Russian aggressor in our homeland. And today we invited our speaker to talk about the Eastern diplomacy, the role of China, and I want to introduce our speaker today. It's Oleksandr Khara, Foreign Affairs and Security Policy expert at Center for Defense Strategies, diplomat advisor to the Defense Minister of Ukraine in 2020. Good afternoon, Mr. Oleksandr. So when we talk about China and their peace plan that was discussed in all levels very actively within the last couple of days, what does it really mean, this peace plan by China? Thank you.
And your interest in this subject, I would like to start from afar, to set the stage for this so-called peaceful plan proposal, because it's not actually a peaceful plan and it's not actually about Ukraine. So, first of all, Russia was China's second largest supplier of crude oil, and in 2022 it increased its import from Russia by 16%. Secondly, the recent article in the Wall Street Journal said that China is supplying more and more chips directly to Russia, worth to 179 million, and via Turkey as well, worth 3.2 million. So we understand that those chips needed for Russia to replenish depleted missiles that are falling onto our head. Secondly, I would like to remind you that, and actually my colleague told that we are in the 9th year of war. And during this course of war, there were at least 3 key resolutions, United Nations General Assembly's resolutions regarding Ukraine. First of all, it was on the March 27, 2014, about the territorial integrity of Ukraine. And then it was a resolution on aggression against Ukraine on the March 2nd, 2022. And recently, on the 23rd of February 2023, there was a resolution on the principles of the Charter of the United Nations underlying a comprehensive, just and lasting peace in Ukraine. So in all 3 of those resolutions, I'm not even mention all those human rights violation resolutions regarding Russian activity on occupied territories, China abstained. So if China is the, let's say, unbiased, impartial world broker who wants to see peace in Ukraine, why China is not voting on the security, on those resolutions in favor of it? What's wrong with those documents? Even though if you have a look at the latest resolution, it was based first and foremost on the UN Charter and certainly Ukrainian peace plan. And there was nothing against Chinese interests or Russian interests in general, because it was just stating the sovereignty, territorial integrity of every state, and then the responsibility for aggression and other things. So China, for some reason, abstained. Secondly, it's about this stage. Recently, Vladimir Putin suspended the Russian participation in New START treaty. Why it's so important? Before the invasion, all-out invasion, Russia used these strategic talks to get some bargains from the United States, and quite often, they were interests of Ukraine and some other nations. So this time we see that the Russians are trying to blackmail the world and Ukraine as well, and now they're showing that there is a willingness on the Russian side to talk about strategic security. And that these talks should take into account Russian interests and first and foremost support of the West towards Ukraine. And what's interesting as well, that there are reports that China is mulling over the idea of supplying some additional arms, possibly UAVs and missiles, to Russia. And we heard a warning from Joseph Biden, and he said while he was meeting Xi Jinping that it's not in the interest of China to supply any arms, to step into this conflict with arms, because Russia suffered a lot because of sanctions and withdrawal of the international companies from Russia, and certainly something similar would happen to China. And given that American market is one of the key markets for Chinese goods, it was $690 billion in bilateral trade last year. So I believe it's pretty good deterrence to China to stay away from this conflict. Why I'm talking about it? I'm just trying to underline the whole vision of China towards this conflict. And then we can judge whether the political, China's position on the political settlement of the crisis in Ukraine, not a war, not an aggression, but a crisis in Ukraine. Firstly, the Chinese talked about this peace proposal during the Munich Security Conference, while Yi, a top foreign policy official of China, hinted that they have such a plan. But when he was describing the situation, he used pretty interesting phrasing. For example, he said that before the war, there were talks between Russians and Ukrainians. But however, it stopped. We don't know what the process was cut short. Some forces, and in the Chinese and Russian, let's say, language, some forces mean the diverse forces of the West, United States and their puppets in Europe. So some forces might not want to see peace talks materialize. They don't care about the lives and deaths of Ukrainians or harm to Europe. So in each and every word of this statement, we see the vision of China of the conflict from the Russian point of view, and actually they share. It's not just they're supporting Russian propaganda, but they just share this worldview. And he was talking about the sovereignty and territorial integrity, and right away about the legitimate security concerns. And it means that China shares the same views that NATO, aggressive NATO, is expanding and is trying to drag Ukraine into its sphere of influence. And that's why there is a legitimate concern of Russia in this war, in this conflict. And certainly, if we have a look at the in the Pacific region, we see the same rhetoric. The Chinese are against the Quad, they're against the AUKUS, because they don't want to have any smaller countries, smaller nations to unite and to protect their interests. Because if you have a look how the Chinese propose to delimitate or demarcate the South China Sea, you wouldn't find any precedents in the international law on this. And then it's actually the way how the Russians wanted to delimitate Ukrainian side, or sorry, the common area of the Azov Sea and the Black Sea in the Kerch Strait. So it was brother type of division rather than just based on international law and precedents. Then the Chinese are talking about, and recently, now you know that so-called president of Belarus now in Beijing, and Xi Jinping said that he wants that other countries abandon all Cold War mentality, reject the legitimacy, respect legitimacy of security concerns of all, and stop politicizing and instrumentalizing the world economy. So it's not about Ukraine. Because no, certainly Ukrainian trade with China is tiny, and we cannot influence the interests of China. But directly, Xi Jinping is conveying his message to Mr. Biden rather than Mr. Zelensky. And actually, it's interesting that Mr. Wang Yi didn't come to Kiev to talk about his boss peace proposal. He went to Moscow. And Xi Jinping is not going to visit Kiev. He is flying to Moscow as well. And it's funny that Alexander Lukashenko said that Belarus has been actively proposing peace and fully supports your initiative, I mean Chinese, on international security. The country that, according to the UN General Assembly Resolution 3314 of 1974, that defines aggression, is committed aggression, is committing aggression by providing its territory to Ukraine, is talking about peace and supporting the peace negotiations. So it's a bit ridiculous, but it's just one of the key elements to highlight how these proposals are absurd in reality. I don't want to reiterate what Russians are saying about this war and their willingness to peace negotiations. For example, recently Mr. Peskov said that there are certain realities, I mean the new Russian territories, there is a constitution of Russian Federation, so they didn't want to talk about any illegally annexed territories of Ukraine. And he just insisted that the goals of special military operations should be carried on. So there is no willingness from the Russian side to pursue peace. And now let's get to the documents itself. Even though it begins with respecting the sovereignty of all countries, but in reality, the Chinese are talking about Taiwan, not Ukraine, because if this is a peace proposal for Ukraine, it should be stated directly that the Chinese government supports territorial integrity and sovereignty of Ukraine, including Crimea and the city of Sebastopol. Abandoning Cold War mentality, it's not about Ukraine as well. It's about the, let's say, reaction of the West towards the Russian aggression and gathering the free nations around the United States and by the lead of the United States and withstanding this pressure on Ukraine. It's not about Ukraine. Ceasing hostility, it's just quite clear that all those proposals of the Chinese, proposals that Chinese might consider sending some weapons, and the Russian blackmail with this New START treaty, and some other ideas like useful idiots in the West calling to stop provision of arms to Ukraine, are aimed for one particular reason, just to stop this fighting, and certainly it would mean more advantage for Russia. And possibly this talks about possibility of sending some arms from China to Russia are due to the depletion of arms that Russians still have at their disposal, and they understand that in a couple of months there would be no enough missiles and drones and other things to carry on war on the same level of intensity. So I believe we will see more and more calls for peace of this kind, and first of all for a ceasefire, rather than the just and lasting peace proposals. Resuming peace talks. Well, certainly Ukraine is open to peace talks, but we've seen that the Russian government, and particularly Mr. Putin, and if you listen to his address to the parliament and to the nation, he has no intention of stopping this war. Resolving humanitarian crisis. Certainly we are interested in it. There are some exchanges of prisoners of war, but we still have at least 14,000 Ukrainian children being illegally and forcefully deported to Russia, and some of them are being adopted by the Russian families, and which constituted the genocide. Protecting civilians and prisoners of war. Well, certainly we are interested, but we still have a lot of people, even from Azovstal, our defenders of Mariupol, are still in captivity in Russia, and the Russians are refusing to exchange them all in all with the Russian Poles. Keeping nuclear power plants safe. It's a great thing, but there is no mentioning who is making these nuclear power plants a dangerous place to be. who has illegally captured Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, and what should the world do to this situation? Why the Chinese are not talking about reckless activities of the Russian armed forces with regard to this station, and not to mention other aspects and nuclear blackmailing. Reducing strategic risk. Certainly, it's the most important point in the whole document, because the Chinese are trying to warn, first and foremost, Russia, its junior partner, not to resort to the nuclear arms, because certainly there would be a reaction, and this reaction might cause a chain reaction and lead to the catastrophe. Facilitating grain exports. Recently, my colleagues from the Black Sea News published data about how the Russians are trying to slow down the flow of ships with grain from Ukraine. So they installed a lot of red ribbons. They're trying to slow down the process. They are making those inspections quite slowly with the aim to harm Ukrainian trade, and certainly some other countries who still believe that it's because of the Western sanctions that Russia is suffering and is not able to provide the developing world with more grain and with more fertilizers. So the Russians are trying to blackmail not just the West, but they are actually repeating let's say, weaponizing food and repeating the Holodomor aspects of Ukrainian tragedy. Then, stopping unilateral sanctions. Certainly, the Chinese are not happy with unilateral sanctions because some of their companies suffered as well. Even though Chinese are not has not been, let's say, noticed by helping a lot to sending a lot of goods to Russia, and especially dual-use goods. But in general, they understand that it's harming their economy, and it might harm them even more, because if there is some contingency in the Indo-Pacific, and we've seen recently a growing number of incidents related to Taiwan, related to Senkaku Islands, and some other actions committed by the PLA, certainly the Chinese are thinking about sanctions being applied to them as well. Keeping industrial and supply chain stable. And certainly we are talking about the rare materials and chips. And we've seen the huge program that the United States is launching, $53 billion investment in chip industry, and Taiwan is building a plant in Arizona, and in some other movements, how to lessen dependency on chips from Taiwan and certainly from China. And there are export control measures applied not just to Russia, Belarus and their satellites, but to China as well. So it's something that is worrying China, because as oil was the key commodity in 21st century or 20th century, chips are commodity of the future. Promotion post-conflict reconstruction. Well, it's a pretty good idea, but I don't think that there is a huge say of China in the post-war reconstruction. I believe that their position, rather pro-Russian and supporting this war, than pro-Ukrainian, would allow Ukrainian government to open all doors for Chinese investment. And we see that, especially if we have a look at the Chinese behavior in developing nations in Africa. So they're behaving not in the let's say, objective or mutually beneficial way. So they're making advantage of those nations and indebt those nations for their particular interests, not of those nations. So in general, and actually I would like to just quote one of the Chinese journalists who said that when she was asked why China is not helping the West to stop this war with Russia, she said, "What do you want? That we help you to just take off Russia, and you concentrate all your efforts and resources to deter China?" Certainly not. So China is not interested in defeat of Russia. Neither it's not interested in victory of Russia. That's why they would love to see Russia as a sort of irritating factor for the West, and West should dedicate some limited resources to coping with two giants, two revisionist powers, rather than just concentrate on China. That's why if we are talking not just what's on the paper of this so-called plan, but in reality just position of China, we see that it's not about Ukraine at all. It's about the Chinese-American relations. It's about the strategic interests of China in the region and actually in the globe as well. Because we need to draw another conclusion, not just Ukraine, but Europe and the rest of the world, about the possible Chinese world. Because now people are saying that 21st century would be a century of China. So we can judge China and how it's going to be a broker of the international system if they are biased in this particularly and a clear-eyed aggression case of Russia against Ukraine. I conclude, and I would be happy to answer your question. Thank you.
Я дякую вам за цю інформацію і хочу, мабуть, уточнити, що це буде.
Thank you for your information, but I would like to ask what would it really mean for us, because on one hand we understand that policy of China is more pro-Russian rather than pro-Ukrainian, and you mentioned it too regarding the supply of weapons. We see this information that emerged a couple of days ago that Russia provides some components to China for manufacturing of nuclear arms, but at the same time we see this peace plan that confirms the integrity of our country. So what this Chinese policy means for us, what should we do? Can we reinforce our diplomatic efforts in this flank, or everything is already solved?
It's guided by its egoistic national interest, first and foremost. And it's just sided with Russia, which is important. So they are not pro-Russian. Let me get to one of the basic things. There was a so-called Primakov doctrine, which has guided the Russian foreign policy since the 90s. And it's based that Russia should pursue a multipolar world. Russia should unite the post-Soviet space. It should counter the expansion of NATO, and it should use China as a leverage against the United States. Because the Russians understand that they are not superpower. They don't have enough resources, so they need someone to use against the United States. China is completely, it's just a mirror of Russia. They don't want to have, even though they're talking about the partnership without limits, but in reality they don't want to be, let's say, burdened by the junior partner, and pretty stupid junior partner, because I believe that meeting just 4 days before the invasion, Putin didn't warn Xi Jinping about his war. Xi Jinping would be happy if Russians would be in Kiev in 3 days and there was a swift victory, and possibly in a week or so. I'm just speculating, but in general they would be doing something towards Taiwan. But now certainly they need to hold back and to think about it twice. So China is guarding its interests, and it happens that it's in the same line with the Russians. We cannot change with all our diplomacy, with all our appeals to international law, or talking that the Russians have already killed 500 Ukrainian kids since 24th of February, and I don't remember exact number of those kids killed since 2014 and before the all-out invasion. So all these humanitarian things, all these appeals to international law are just, they will fail on deaf ears. So the only way how to deal with China is to side with those who support our sovereignty and territorial integrity, to name the United States, United Kingdom, and our partners in Europe. That's it. Secondly, the most important thing for us is fight back, because as it was in 2014, the West imposed sanctions on Crimea, but they were just mostly symbolic one. And certainly Putin decided that, I can go on with war, of proxy war in Donbass for some time, and then prepare for the full assault as we've seen it in 2022. So that's why gathering support for Ukraine, military, financial, humanitarian, and diplomatic, is the most important thing. And I believe that Ukraine needs to be more active, not with China, because I see, we need to talk to them. We need, and then actually President Zelensky invited Xi Jinping to talk or to meet somewhere, and possibly in Kiev. It's not going to happen. But we should approach Chinese. But the most important thing is we should talk to the so-called global south. If we have a look at the voting of those resolution and recent one, 141 nations voted for the principles of the UN Charter underlying the comprehensive, just and lasting peace for Ukraine. 7 or 6 friends of Russia voted with Russia, and 32 nations abstained. 32 nations consist half of the world population. And a lot of nations, and particularly it's pitiful that India is in this camp. And sometimes Indian politicians sound like the Kremlin propagandists. So they are talking and they are spreading the same lies about Ukraine, about the West, and they don't want to be lectured, and so on, so on, so on. So Ukraine needs to approach the global South, because this war has many layers, and there is a colonial layer as well. So we've been colony of Russia for more than 300 years. We had a brief period of independence after the revolution in 1917, and we lost it. 30 years of independence since 1991. But anyway, the Russians consider us to be non-existent, neither nation, language, identity, or state. So that's why there is a parallel to the anti-colonial war. And actually some nations, and I should recall I believe it was a Prime Minister of Kenya who, when he listened to the speeches, and he said, I feel something similar, because we are former colony, and we understand this language that Russians are using against Ukraine. So we should reach out to global south. We have no possibility to influence Chinese decision, because it's against their interests first and foremost. And secondly, I call this number $690 billion of trade in goods. This is a factor. We don't have such a leverage to push China and to be more responsible international player.
Дякую вам, шановні колеги. Якщо є питання, прошу.
Надія Юрченко, Укрінформ. На останній прес-конференції президент Зеленський
Nadia Yurchenko, Ukrinform. During the last peace conference, President Zelensky, while commenting the peace proposals of China, said that Ukraine better keeps China where it is now, and some items are completely unacceptable. Meanwhile, on other articles we may cooperate. So what are the articles we may cooperate with China on? Thank you.
Знаєте, це як
Well, first of all, just like Ostap Bender said, I would like to take it in parts, but I need all of it. If we talk about this plan, what Chinese say that what they have, this plan, it should be a compromise for all parties involved, including Russia. Well, Russia first of all. And this compromise, we understand what it may be. It's our refuse of certain territories, and I don't know how is it possible, but in Chinese mass media it was popular to show a map of Ukraine, and part of Ukraine was shown as demilitarized zone. So according to Chinese plans, no Ukrainian armed forces or weapons should be present there, which would, in opinion of the barbarians from the north, our neighbor barbarians from the north, would not pose any threat to them. So we know that when any countries conceded any of their territories, they were losing their sovereignty in general. So for talking about separate articles, I would say that it's non-use of the nuclear arms. if China includes Ukraine in the first place to their first article on the territorial integrity of Ukraine, that would be something significant for me, but they just promote their rights to invade Taiwan. Some might say that everybody supports the territorial integrity of Ukraine, and only 7 friends of Putin were voting against the territorial integrity of Ukraine. But there is something that we have in reality. China may say that they respect the territorial integrity of Ukraine, but only those countries who are strong enough can return their territories. But we've heard the last statements by China that they may return the rebellious islands using their military force. So this item is specifically made so vague in order not to be about Ukraine, but about their counter stance towards the United States. Well, the exchange of prisoners is something important. Return of our children, return of our prisoners of war. This is something important in a humanitarian sense. The reduction of strategic risks is again not about Ukraine, but rather about United States and Russia. We see that Russia threats with withdrawing from the Treaty on Conventional Arms. And Lavrov said that we are not going to do anything. We're not going to increase the number of nuclear warheads. So we are ready to listen to your proposals, maybe at the account of Ukrainian territories. So to me, humanitarian issue is something that is more or less acceptable to us. The rest is very vaguely written. So, and they do not concern any interests of Ukraine. Thank you, dear friends. Do we have any more questions on the floor? Thank you very much for this very powerful conversation. I'm reminding you, joining us was Oleksandr Khara, the expert at the Center for Defense Strategies, diplomat advisor to the Defense Minister of Ukraine 2020. Dear colleagues, I'm reminding you at our next briefing is at 14:13. Joining us will be the representative of Juvenile Prevention Directorate of the National Police. So bear with us. Trust in Armed Forces. Glory to Ukraine.